Shall we get things going?
Yes.
Wonderful. Hi, everybody. Oh. Oh, man. Oh, jeez. Oh, wow. Wait.
Yeah.
One sec.
Let's see if this one's on. This one's maybe they're raw. I guess they're raw. It says locked. Locked.
Yeah. Oh, no. Hello, everybody. Look at this working mic. My name is Jacob. I'm an employee here at Ann Arbor District Library. I am so glad to be here with you this evening for an author event with Michelle Adams. She is the author of The Containment, Detroit, the Supreme Court, and the Battle for Racial Justice in the North. Before we get started here, I have some library-related announcements. If you are in need of using the restroom, you'll head out those doors you came in and to your right, and then you are flanked on both sides by bathrooms. We also have hearing assistance for those who might be in need. Those are those headsets you see right when you came in. You just wear them like a normal headset and it amplifies the sound. Hopefully you noticed on the way in we have some books for sale. So maybe after this, the talk, you'll be able to purchase books. And then I think Michelle will be so kind to sign a few.
Yes, I will.
Wonderful. Yeah, as many as possible. So I'm going to introduce our interlocutor for tonight's conversation, and then he will introduce Michelle. So we are joined by Jim or James. I just want to be polite. Jim Tobin is a professor of journalism at Miami University in Oxford, Ohio, educated at the University of Michigan, where he earned bachelor's and doctoral degrees in history. He spent 20 years as a newspaper reporter and freelance writer. His books include Ernie Pyle's War, America's Eyewitness to World War II, which won the National Book Critics Circle Award in biography. To Conquer the Air, The Wright Brothers and the Great Race for Flight, which won the J. Anthony Lucas Work in Progress Award, and The Man He Became, How FDR Defied Polio to Win the Presidency. In the classroom, he specializes in narrative nonfiction, both historical and contemporary. Let's welcome Jim and Michelle.
Thank you, Jake. Is that working now?
Yeah.
Good, thanks. Thanks very much for coming out on a snowy night. I'm very pleased to welcome you.
Jim, can everybody hear you?
Can you all hear me okay? Everybody in back? Okay. It's an honor to introduce Michelle Adams. She was raised in Detroit. She was educated at Brown University, where she got her BA and law degrees from CUNY and Harvard. She taught for years at the Cardozo School of Law at Yeshiva University and came to U of M only a couple of years ago. And I noted in her vita that she unfairly won her last year at Cardozo, Professor of the Year. She came to Michigan and won the L. Hart Wright Teaching Award, which is a big deal at the law school. So I don't know how she worked that out, but it's an amazing double accomplishment. You may have seen Jeffrey Toobin's rave review in the New York Times Book Review of The Containment, just this past weekend. As I say, it was an absolute rave. You couldn't ask for a better review. And I put down the review and I said, he didn't say the half of it. This is an extraordinary book. I sometimes say that there are books that I admire and there are books that I love. This is a book that I loved. It is not just a very important work of history, it is also a page-turner. Legal history is tough, but what she has managed to do is construct a narrative out of this terribly important and historic case that absolutely had me on the edge of my seat. And I think it's going to have that effect on many people around the country. She is a terrific storyteller. The book is full of great characters. And I was thinking, why did this book mean so much to me? Now, I grew up in the Detroit area, and I was in high school at the time of these events. So I do relate to the book in many ways. But you don't have to have that sort of relationship to these events to have this book educate and move you the way that it did me. I felt the way I felt when I read Isabel Wilkerson's The Warmth of Other Suns about the Great Migration. I felt that I understood the world I had grown up in a new way. Double that for this book. So I urge you to buy it. I urge you to read it. You will not be sorry. So, Michelle, congratulations.
Thank you.
I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about your biography as a born and raised in Detroit and how that brought you to the subject of the book.
Well, I'm happy to do that. Can you all hear me? First, I want to say thank you, Jim. I want to say thank you both to Literate and for the library for inviting me to speak, and for you taking your incredibly important and precious time to read my book. That's why I did it, and that's why I spent the time to really try to move people and get them to think about our world and to get them to think about our world through the lens of the past. So the question you asked me was, tell us about yourself. I'm from Detroit. I grew up in Palmer Woods, which some of you may know, which is sort of close to the border of 8 Mile of Eminem fame. I remember going to the state fair back when it was across the street all those years. And so I think the key thing to know about me is I grew up with one foot in 2 different worlds. I had one foot in a very black world of black professionals. Almost all of the dads and the moms that I knew and the sort of world that I grew up in was, an HBCU. Everybody went to an HBCU, whether it was Fisk, whether it was Howard. Both my parents attended Howard. That's where everybody was educated. And so they were doctors, they were lawyers, they were school administrators, they were nurses, they were judges. And so I grew up in this moment of optimism and this moment of strong black pride. And I also grew up in, the other thing to know about me is I grew up in an MLK home, right? The advice I grew up on was integration. So that was a big part of my life, and that was sort of where I lived and where I came back to. The other foot was in Bloomfield Hills, which I'm sure you guys all know. We're not very far from there now. I went to Roper City and Country School, starting at the age of not even 3 or just about 3, all the way through high school. And so this other part of me was in a private school. And for those of you who may or may not know about Roper, it was created by and founded by 2 folks who had managed to escape Germany in the 1930s. Anne-Marie Roper was Jewish, and they had founded a school there. And effectively what had happened when Hitler came to power was they attempted to turn the school into a Hitler youth camp, and they knew they had to get out of town, and they did. And they were able to get out. And so they brought this sort of a really intense, question authority was the idea, humanism, open classroom. And so that was the kind of environment I grew up in, sort of my other foot. The other thing was that they were early to integration. There were black students at Roper in the 1960s and in the 1970s, although there weren't that many. And that's part of what happened for me in terms of thinking about sort of how did I get here and what's my origin story. And I wondered about this, and you'll see in the book that I talk a little bit about it. So I graduated from high school in 1981, and I wanted to get out of Detroit. And of course, at that point in time, the auto industry is having a very, very difficult time. The economy is having a very, very difficult time. And I thought that the best thing for me to do would be to leave town and sort of, make my name outside of Detroit. Although I will say, my dad was a lawyer, and we can talk a little bit about him because he's in the book too. And I got into the University of Michigan, and initially my thought was I wanted to go to school here. And I also got into Brown University, and my mother was like, you gotta go to Brown, and I'm like, well, it's a lot more expensive. And I was really concerned about the cost. And she was really insistent that I do that. And so that was part of it, and then another part of it was just sort of the state of Detroit at the time. And so I left Detroit in 1981, and I didn't come back here until I started at Michigan a couple of years ago. So it's been a journey that has been amazing. I've had an amazing career as a law professor, first at Seton Hall and then at Cardozo. I see my colleague Eko Yanka here, who was at Cardozo with me, and then at the University of Michigan. That background, I think, was incredibly rich, and I had the opportunity to have an extraordinary education, and it also led me to ask a lot of questions.
This is the story of a court case, of litigation. Can you give us a kind of thumbnail sketch of what this case was?
Yeah, I'm happy to do that. I'm going to give a high level, and then we can step back and talk about some of the things that are going on in the book and some of the narrative that you talked about and some of the characters. So the high level is this, in like 2 or 3 sentences. In 1970, the NAACP, the Detroit branch of the NAACP, sued state and local school officials saying that black students in Detroit had been discriminated against, that essentially the city was running a separate and unequal school system, okay? It was state and local officials. The top level is that the NAACP brought this case. They drew a judge named Stephen Roth. Stephen Roth was from the conservative wing of the Democratic Party, and he was very skeptical of the plaintiff's claims. But over a period of time and over this trial that we'll talk about, he sort of comes to understand that, in fact, the schools in Detroit were significantly segregated. He rules in favor of the NAACP. Roth, at that point, says, what's the remedy? He looks down south. He says, Brown versus Board of Education. The Supremes have said the remedy there is desegregation. Roth says that's not really possible in the city of Detroit. That's about 2/3 black, and as folks are leaving the city, white folks are leaving the city, and state and crucially, state officials had also engaged in segregation and violated the Constitution. And he says what we need to do is have metropolitan desegregation. And so what effectively Roth orders is the biggest metropolitan city suburban school district integration plan in the history of the United States. It would have affected about 800,000 students and would have affected about 50 or so suburban school districts along with the city of Detroit. This is a remedy, again, that he thought was mandated by Brown. It goes up to what's called the intermediate federal court. What's here, it's called the Sixth Circuit. We don't need to really focus on that except to say that it's another federal court. Another federal court twice says, yeah, that's right. And then we get to the Supreme Court in 1974. And in 1974, the Supreme Court overturns Roth's order and says that this metropolitan integration plan is unconstitutional effectively and strikes it down. So that's the high level. And it's that trial that forms the core of the book. And we can talk more now about sort of the characters and sort of how this story all fits together.
The case is called Milliken v. Bradley. Milliken was Governor William Milliken, and Verda Bradley was the chief plaintiff, the mother of.
Well, she was the named plaintiff, right?
And several, right?
Yeah, there were several plaintiffs. They were all parents of children who were attending Detroit schools, And the way, it's alphabetical, right? So B's early in the alphabet, and so Verda Bradley is the first name plaintiff, and so that's how.
She probably said, "Thanks a lot. I wish my name had been."
I think her son definitely felt that way.
Yeah. Do you remember? You've taught about race discrimination, segregation. This has been part of your career. Surely you knew about Bradley v. Milliken pretty early, but do you remember the moment when you thought, anybody done a book about that?
Well, it's interesting. I've always been interested in Detroit. I've always been interested in this case because it takes place in Detroit, and then I teach constitutional law and a bunch of related topics. And so I would read about it, and I would, every year I would kind of teach the case, and I would think there's something going on there. It's really interesting. And then I went and I looked at one point about all the books about Brown. There were like 25, 30 books about Brown. And I started thinking, well, how many books are there about Milliken versus Bradley? And there was like 1.5. And I read them, and they were really, really interesting, but there wasn't that much about the case in terms of really explaining what happened. And so I kept thinking, I want to know more, and I kept digging and reading more and more and more. And I thought, well, I'm interested in this. And I thought, if I'm interested in this, then maybe other folks will be too. And so ultimately what I did was I wrote the book I wanted to read. And I hoped that folks would come along with me. But it was just a sort of a process of talking about the case, realizing the case was really important, trying to explain it to my students, not being able to explain it, there not really being that many books out there about the case, and then getting interested in it. And it was kind of like a Sherlock Holmes type thing of like, I have to read more, I want to know more, I have to read more. And that's sort of how this process got started.
When you start to realize, as you read the book, as I did anyway, you think, oh my God, this case is as important as Brown versus Board of Education. Now, I grew up with Judge Roth's name in the newspaper headlines. It was a big deal when I was a kid.
You remember that?
Oh yeah, but it was never, it never dawned on me just how what the import of it was until
I can tell you some of the names he was called in the newspaper.
Oh, I'm sure you can. Yeah. And
not nice.
And outside of the newspaper, I'm sure it was much worse.
Not nice. Not nice.
No, I remember that. He was. I grew up in the suburb of Birmingham, Lily White. My folks were liberal Democrats, but most of my friends' parents were not, and so Judge Roth was a bad guy, I want to ask you about Judge Roth in some detail in a minute. Give us the setting. What was Detroit and southeastern Michigan, more precisely? What were the racial demographics in the 1960s and early 70s?
Okay, so this goes back thinking about Detroit, which is, the Detroit population peaked around 1950, and then it begins to decline in terms of the population, right? And this is the black population is increasing, the white population is diminishing, right? So by the time we get to the late 60s, early 70s, what you have is a city that is beginning to be majority black. But there's still substantial white population, particularly in the northern part of the city. Meanwhile, in the suburbs, it's virtually all white. It's very different now, but and there are reasons that we can talk about as to why that is, but basically the suburbs are all white, with very few exceptions. And so that's really the dividing line between the city and the suburbs in the late 1960s and the early 1970s is quite significant.
And if you look at the racial map of Detroit in, say, 1968, 1970, the pattern is very clear.
Maybe you're referring to the maps that are in the
book. Well, yeah, I mean that's save that for the Judge Roth story. But what did that map look like in terms of where are the black neighborhoods?
So, just a little preview in terms of the trial. What you had in the trial was there were these exhibits and they were census maps. And so, as you know, every 10 years they do a census. And so they had the census maps going from 1940, 1950, 1960, 1970, and you could see the black population was sort of in the center city area of Detroit, and it's really clumpy. And then each 10 years it was kind of growing a little bit and kind of opening up a little bit. And so finally by 1970, you're getting closer to the borders of the city of Detroit. But you can see that there's a really interesting racial pattern in the city of Detroit where black folks are living pretty contained in specific areas.
No question about it. I mean, it's perfectly obvious. And I think white people weren't terribly aware, as Judge Roth was not aware of that pattern.
Yeah, Judge Roth, I think Judge Roth's position was that, you know, there are ethnic neighborhoods everywhere. There are ethnic neighborhoods in Detroit. There are ethnic neighborhoods across the country. And so folks of different ethnicities want to live together. And so that helps to explain why black folks live where they live.
As I said, there are vivid characters throughout this book. I'm going to ask you to give just little thumbnail snapshots of several. Abraham Zwerdling.
Okay, Abraham Zwerdling was the president, the head of the Detroit School Board. And that name may sound familiar. He's an Ann Arborite. He went to the University of Michigan, went to the law school here. He's from Ann Arbor. He was educated in high school here. I don't remember the name of the high school now.
I'm not sure which.
Yeah, this is before Community, maybe Pioneer, maybe before Pioneer.
Oh yeah, before Pioneer.
Yeah.
Ann Arbor High, I guess.
Yeah, and so Zwerdling's an interesting guy. He's a mid-century guy, and he is really interested. He's an MLK guy, and he believes really. He's a lawyer. He was a labor lawyer, and he really believes in integration. He thinks that segregation is wrong, and so he's somebody who has seen the light. And what's interesting about him is that the Detroit School Board had gone through a variety of different permutations, but by the mid-1960s, for the first time ever, you really do have a school board that is controlled by liberals, right? There had been sort of more progressive members of the school board prior to that, but you have a liberal orientation in the school board starting around 1965 or so, and Zwerdling becomes the head of it. And one of the things he really wants to accomplish is integrating the schools. He understands the schools in Detroit are segregated, and he wants to integrate them. Interestingly, too, the thing about Zwerdling is that he's a little headstrong, maybe not the best politician, but he understands something very crucial, and that is that the reason why black folks are clumping or contained where they are has to do with governmental policy. And he really wants to sort of pivot and say, well, you know, a lot of the reasons why these things are happening have to do with housing segregation and other kinds of segregation that are created by government actors, not necessarily by us. And if we really want to have meaningful integration in the Detroit schools, what we have to do is we've got to include the suburbs. So he was giving sort of speeches about this, you know, before the lawsuit starts. So you've really got a guy who's pretty zealous, and he really does sort of become one of the heroes of the book. And we can talk about sort of what happens to him as well. So that's one thumbnail. Who's next?
I hate to go so fast because there's so many permutations with each of these characters. Albert Clegg.
Albert Clegg, Detroit's leading black nationalist. If you guys have been downtown or been down to around Linwood, he had a church, Shrine of the Black Madonna. Very close, but he knew Malcolm X quite well. He knew MLK. He was a very strong activist, a brilliant guy. Went to Oberlin. I think was incredibly emotionally damaged by segregation, as were so many black folks. Most black folks of that generation. Starts out, was really committed to trying to provide equal educational opportunity for black folks. Started out being sort of more attached with the NAACP, and then makes a move in the mid-'60s and becomes a strong proponent of community control of the schools. And so what really gets this case in motion in 1967 is you've got this intense meeting between Zwerdling, who's on the school board, and he's Mr. Integration, and then you've got Clegg, who basically says, you know, you guys have been miseducating black children for all this time. We want white folks out of the schools, right? There's no reason to think that they're going to do any better. We want black control, black schools for black children.
Teachers.
And black teachers have been discriminated against. And so they have this public sort of table-pounding match that gets reported on the front page of the Detroit Free Press. And this is sort of the first sequence in the book where you start to sort of see what's happening in the Detroit public schools.
Then that leads to the name that people will be more likely to recognize, Coleman Young.
Coleman Young before he becomes mayor of the city of Detroit. So Coleman Young obviously is well known across the country, Detroit's longest serving mayor. Coleman Young is a really interesting guy. In 1950s, sort of has a HUAC moment that is broadcast across Detroit. He's a radical. He's called in front of HUAC, which is sort of a roving, and is moved into Detroit to sort of suss out all the communists. He's asked, in fact, is he a communist? And he's like, I'm not going to tell you the answer, and all this kind of stuff.
He says, I think you must have mistaken me for a stool pigeon.
Yeah, I mean, he's just, he's just full of fire, and he is, at that moment in time, quite radical. Then he decides, listen, I want to run for state senate. So he becomes a state legislator. And he sort of, as he gets a little bit older, sort of turns in that radicalism and turns it towards a little bit more of pragmatism. And he's quite brilliant, and he becomes a very effective state legislator representing a black district in Detroit. But he's sort of got one foot in the community control camp and one foot in the integrationist camp. And so when there's this big push for community control, which is happening across the country, not just here in Detroit, he says, I really want to be at the forefront of creating a state statute that's going to give more, that's going to direct the city school board to decentralize, that is to break up the school district, give black parents more authority within the schools. And so he actually spearheads this law that effectively does that, but then of course it's sort of like a catcher receiving the pitcher's ball. So then Zwerdling gets this authorization. He says, you know what, while we're at it, let's integrate the Detroit public high schools while we're at it. Not a huge integration plan, but a more limited one. And it's the combination of decentralization and this limited integration plan. And when Zwerdling sort of clumsily puts this forward, and he does, he gets the votes, that's when all hell breaks loose. And then we go back to the state legislature once again, and now the state passes a law. The state of Michigan passed a law that basically voided the limited integration plan in the city of Detroit. And that's when the NAACP gets involved, because they're saying, wait a minute, the state passed a law to get rid of integration. That feels pretty Southern, right? That feels like a Brown violation. And that's the beginning of the lawsuit, when the NAACP gets involved.
June Shagaloff.
Hold on one second. June Shagaloff, who I had the great honor of interviewing a couple of times before she died. Fabulous. The Johnny Appleseed of Northern DSEG. June Shagaloff sort of gets hired right out of NYU College to work for Thurgood Marshall. She called him Mr. Marshall all her life. And is basically a community organizer on steroids. And she and Robert Carter, who was the general counsel of the NAACP, in the late 1950s basically come together, and they put together a program for trying to desegregate northern public schools. And one of the things that she does is flies across the country to all kinds of places, San Francisco and Seattle, Los Angeles, and basically organizes the parents on the ground who are pushing to desegregate public schools in the North. And this is a key point, because one of the things I think that gets lost is the idea that in the 1960s, black parents were organizing, protesting, boycotting, trying to get their schools desegregated in the North. Boston, Chicago, LA, Seattle, Detroit, there was a lawsuit here around the northern high school. And so this is just a sort of lost story that I tell in the book as well, because I think the perception is sort of like, you know, maybe black folks weren't interested in integration. They were, but then that changes, and that's part of the story as well. And so she's running around trying to organize and helping to organize, and she's just an amazing character in this book as well.
Somebody might be thinking, well, there's no Southern type segregation laws on the books in Michigan. There's no law that says black children may not go to school with white children.
In fact, there was the opposite. Michigan barred race discrimination in public schools.
So how can they be sued for racial discrimination in the
It's a
schools?
mystery, isn't it? It's a mystery.
And if you can fit in this basic distinction, de jure, de facto.
Okay, so now we're going to do a little con law. We'll do a little bit of constitutional law. So de jure is just a fancy word for saying by law. And de facto is just a fancy word for saying we don't know where it came from.
But it's the reality on the ground.
Yeah, so today we might say the schools are racially identifiable, right? But what de facto means is that we can't trace it to some governmental action, right? And so, you know, Brown, which was decided in 1954, and then Brown 2, which came along the next year, and then you had another case in 1968. These are all cases in the South, right? And so they all deal with the kind of classic Jim Crow that we're all familiar with: whites-only drinking fountains, separated schools, blacks can't vote, fire hoses on black children, all of this kind of stuff, which is sort of burned into our memories. Little Rock 9, Arkansas. And that's what we tend to think of when we think about Jim Crow. And so when we get above the Mason-Dixon line, we get to places like Detroit and Los Angeles and Seattle, the question becomes, well, these racially identifiable schools, like, how did they get that way, which was your question. And so there's no law that requires it, but it turns out that the bottom line is that Jim Crow was a nationwide policy. It just appeared in different guises in different regions, right? And that's the other sort of big story that I wanted to tell in this book, because today there's still so much confusion about this. The Supreme Court today is confused about this, right? There's this notion that there's this massive distinction between de jure, which is what happened in the South, and then what happened in the North, who knows what caused it, right? A huge amount of the segregation, particularly in the 1960s, 1950s, 1970s, in the North could be traced directly to governmental policy, right? And so in the North, we had a policy of separating schools and neighborhoods by race, but it wasn't anywhere near as obvious as it was in the South, right? And so the task, the problem, the thing that the lawyers had to do in a case like the Detroit case was, because now we kind of have our oversight, our overview of that is, well, how can we prove that the schools are segregated when there's no law that requires it? And that was the hard part in all these northern cases. And there have been some other northern cases before the Detroit case. And so one of the things that that the defendants' school authorities would do in these northern cases is they would say, well, you know, we have the neighborhood school rule, and so if you live in a particular neighborhood, we require you to go to school in that neighborhood. We don't know why the neighborhoods look the way they do. We don't know how they got that way, and
or people want to live in these
people want to live in the neighborhoods. And at any rate, it's not on us, right? We're just the school authorities, right? We're not responsible for what happens in the neighborhoods. So, and this was a winning argument in many northern cases where there was challenges to school segregation in the North in the 1960s, right? And so one of the things the lawyers wanted to do in Detroit was to pierce that fantasy, which was to try to get at the housing piece of this, because effectively what was happening was the Detroit school authorities were building a system of school segregation on top of neighborhood segregation. They were incorporating the neighborhood segregation directly into the schools, but then the school authorities were turning around and saying, but you know what, it wasn't us. We're not responsible. There's no constitutional violation. So this is a long-winded answer to your question, but the question is, well, how do you show that? And so what's really notable about the Detroit case is that you have a 41-day trial, 10 days of which are entirely on housing. You've got a school case within you've got a housing case within a school case, which is, and there'd never been a housing case within a school case that was this elaborate. And so the lawyers come along and they start having, you know, somebody who is an expert in the federal housing administration come in and talk about redlining. And then they had somebody come in and talk about racially restrictive covenants, and I can explain what all these things are. And then they had somebody come in and talk about what would happen when black folks tried to move to the suburbs, and about law enforcement and whether and the violence that went on. And then they had somebody come in and talk about public housing and how all public housing was segregated. And then they had somebody come in and talk about, well, how did they make determinations as to how to site the schools and when they were going to build new schools? Because what you got to remember, too, is that this is mid-century America. This is the moment of suburban expansion. This is the moment of there's a lot of money, right? Schools are being built. And the decision about where to site a school is crucial in terms of who's going to attend that school if you then require the students in that school to have to be living in that particular neighborhood. And so they had all of this evidence come in about, you know, what the federal government was doing, what the state was doing, what the localities were doing, and all the different ways that Northern Jim Crow was created, maintained, and prosecuted within this school case. And that's really what made this case so remarkable, was the breadth of the evidence, was the way that they did it, was the maps, the exhibits, and then you've got this judge.
So let's talk about Judge Stephen Roth. He's the one that this complicated argument persuades. Tell us about his sort of journey through this trial.
So here's your judge, born in 1908, Hungarian immigrant, sails to this country in steerage, grows up in Flint, also a U of M graduate, interested in local politics, prosecutor, conservative Democrat, right? Was known to use racial epithets in private, man of his time, gets appointed to the federal bench by JFK, 1962. Not particularly, certainly not progressive by today's standards. But the key thing about this guy is he's a mid-century conservative, which means that he brings to judging and what it means to be a judge with something approaching an open mind, in the sense that he was open to being persuaded by something called facts. There were facts, and he didn't, you know, his preconceived notion was, when the NAACP walks into his courtroom, he's like, "Get out of here! I'm not computer operated. I think this case is BS. I don't believe that there's, you know, I don't think there's any segregation in Detroit, whether it's de jure, de facto, whatever fancy name you want to give it." But he was open to being persuaded, and over the course of this trial, you have somebody who changes and goes from being a skeptic to being evangelical, right? And he, you know, he just sort of, he listens to what the lawyers have to say. He listens to what the defendants have to say. And at some point along the line, and we can talk about sort of when this happens and who brings the crucial information in about the remedy, he starts to realize that, in fact, segregation, the reason why the schools are racially identifiable in Detroit, isn't just happenstance. It's not de facto. It's not just this is because people want to live where they want to live. The schools are segregated because of government policy. And if they're segregated because of government policy, then the key case, the guiding light, is Brown versus Board of Education. Whether we're above the Mason-Dixon or below the Mason-Dixon line, Brown versus Board of Education is the guiding light. And that was what he's a lower federal court judge. He's bound by precedent. Brown, of course, was a Southern case, but he thinks, well, Brown applies here too. Brown applies here too, and he changes. And one of the things I want to do in the book is really take the reader on that journey of allowing themselves to be convinced by facts, allowing themselves to be open to facts, allowing themselves to listen to a story that the lawyers are trying to tell, and allowing themselves to believe that it's possible for all of us to start in one position and go to another.
I love your story about how the NAACP lawyers made sure that the maps of segregated Detroit are sitting every day right in front of Judge Roth's face.
Sometimes with being a lawyer, sometimes you just gotta, the little things matter. Just where are you gonna put those exhibits? Where are you gonna post I mean, I went downtown and I tried to get those exhibits. I tried. I went down there, I just everything I could, and I was like, where are they? Da, da, da. Could not find them. We reconstructed them. But these maps, they were massive. These are the census maps I was telling you about, right? I think they were like 10 by 20. I mean, they were huge, right? I mean, massive maps, right? And so, and they had overlays, and they had the plastic thing, and they pull it back, and da 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 da. And he just would, he would sit back, and he would just sort of glance at the maps. And I think the defendants must have known they were in trouble right then and there when he kept looking at those maps and the spread of black people and why
so
they were.
obvious. You have the maps in the book that you reconstructed.
Yeah, I had a fantastic graduate student who reconstructed those maps.
And so he's looking at it and saying, well, somebody did this. I mean, like, how did this happen?
Yeah.
This pattern.
Yeah, but
Yeah.
you know, so I think that I think Roth's a really interesting character, and he's. We're talking about this idea of the soul force, right? And you know, you don't. We talk and I talk about King, and I don't think we're sort of getting ahead of the story, but sort of
Okay.
there being a lot of different people in a lot of different places who are moving together. They may not always all agree. I'm hesitant to call Roth a hero. He's part of the soul force, right? He's part of the group of people. You know, the table had been set for Roth, right? I mean, I don't want to make too much of his
Yeah.
transformation.
You make this point in the last chapter of the epilogue about where he fits into this whole story.
Yeah, I mean, I really wanted to make sure that I did that, which is like, if you don't have the black activists in the '60s who are basically putting themselves on the line, you don't get Roth, right? And so it's part of a larger phenomenon, and I think this is just a story, the totality of which I don't think has been told.
So tell us about the remedy.
So Roth sits through this trial, 41 days, 10 days of housing, FHA, racially restrictive covenants, 2 separate broker associations. There were black brokers and white realtors, state endorsed, segregated public housing, white citizens councils with violent tendencies. And a lot of the information he got actually bled across the 8 Mile line, right? So the case was about segregation within the city of Detroit, but a lot of the evidence sort of had a spread to it, which of course the defendants didn't like. But you know, it's one of these sayings that, you know, you can't unring a bell, right? And so once he finds that there's what we call the liability phase of the case, which is the constitutional violation, is the segregation state created, is there state action, then the question becomes, what's the appropriate remedy? So you still might think, well, okay, the segregation's in the city of Detroit, and so the remedy ought to be there too. And I think what Roth said was, well, he had been influenced by the housing evidence. And he says, one of the defendants in the case, or a bunch of the defendants, are state officials, right? The governor, the head of the state board of education, and of course in Michigan, education is a state function, right? Also in Michigan, all of the school districts are by state law, they're state agencies. So when the city board does X, it's actually effectively the acts of the state of Michigan, right? Then you had the fact that the state of Michigan up until 1962 was responsible for oversight in terms of where schools were going to be sited, which is this crucial piece, right? So there's lots of evidence of state involvement and the fact that under state law, Michigan can redraw school district lines at will. And so all of this taken together, and Brown, and the idea we need to have a meaningful remedy, he says, well, look, you know, southeastern Michigan is actually, it's a unit, it's a statistical metropolitan area. There's all this interaction among the city of Detroit and the suburbs. It's one economic unit. Mm-hmm. There's all kinds of ways that the city and the state come together to try to deal with regional problems like transportation, et cetera. And so why can't this just be like that? So what we're going to do is we're going to appoint a desegregation panel, but the broad outlines were this. We're going to have a real metropolitan desegregation plan, an integration plan. And it's going to include about 50 suburbs, suburban school districts, and the city of Detroit. And then he appointed a panel to kind of work this out. But importantly, he instructed the panel to be careful about a variety of things that people really care about now. Number one, let's not fire all the black teachers, right? Let's not do that. Number two, if there's going to be transportation of students, busing, it's got to be two-way. Can't just put all that pressure on the black students. White students have to be, the transportation has to go both ways. Number three, we got to keep the length of time that students are going to be in transportation down. We don't want to have kids, you know, traveling as far as I used to travel from Detroit to Roper. We want to have, you know, the top transportation time be about 20 minutes, not too long. We're going to try to have some walk-in, or we're going to have to try to have some schools, if we're on the border of Detroit, maybe have some of the stuff that doesn't even require busing. And there's tracking. There's information in the panel report about, he also was sort of looking, or the panel was looking out saying, you know what, we don't want in-school segregation either, right? Now the report never became final, in part because the Supremes overturned this, but some of the things that people really are concerned about when it comes to integration, the panel was at least trying to issue spot and to think about. But Roth thought that the appropriate remedy for a violation of this nature was to create the opportunities that go with integration, and that had been what was the remedy in the South, and there was no reason for that not to be the remedy here. And school district lines were artificial and shouldn't prevent the students who had been discriminated against from being able to have access to that remedy.
I have to accelerate a little bit so that we make sure there's time for these folks to ask questions, and I'm sure you have some. Okay, so this has explosive effects throughout southeastern Michigan. Once this remedy is announced, it's appealed. It's upheld. Roth's decision is upheld at the circuit court level. It's appealed twice, and it's appealed to the Supreme Court. So tell us what happens, and tell us how the court was different than it had been when Brown was decided in the 50s.
So there's a bunch of interlocking stories that are happening in the book. One of them is about the change from the Warren Court, which many of us understand as being a really liberal, or a much more liberal court than the one we have today, the transition to the Burger Court, right? And so you've got the election which is actually, looking back in it now, is a relatively narrow election, 1968, between Humphrey and Nixon, with Wallace running as a third party. And so Nixon winning that election is really important. I can't overemphasize that. And then we can talk about democracy and how that falls into this book too. But Nixon wins, and he ran against the Warren Court, right? That was part of what he ran against. And you run against the Warren Court, you should believe people when they tell you what they're going to do. And so he gets 4 appointments to the Supreme Court, and it changes that court. A lot of constitutional scholars look back at the Burger Court as being a kind of a transitional court between, you get a much more conservative court after that, the Rehnquist Court, and then you get the Roberts Court. But, looking back on it now, the Burger Court was a little bit more conservative than I think it was initially appreciated. And so, the case begins in 1970, sort of, right as Nixon is sort of making these appointments. But remember, for the lawyer's perspective, they're still dealing with Warren Court. And all these precedents are Warren Court precedents. And we get to the Supreme Court, though. By the time this case gets to the Supreme Court in 74, the court is quite conservative. And the court strikes down Roth's plan. But one more thing, without giving away too much, right? Roth had sort of come under extraordinary amounts of fire. You remember this. Roth starts having heart attacks. And his clerk told me on the record that he thinks that, the pressure and the stress of the Detroit case undermined his health. And so Roth dies of his, second or third heart attack 2 weeks before the Supreme Court overturned his order.
Maybe a blessing.
Pardon?
Maybe a blessing.
Well, his clerk told me that he thought it was. But it's just this intense thing where, you've got this transformation of this guy, and he's under extraordinary pressure, dies of the heart attack, and then the Supremes overturn. And let me be clear, and just to bring us all together and have some con law, the part of the case where the plaintiffs or the NAACP showed that the school authorities violated the Constitution, that part was never overturned. There's no question, at least from the higher court's perspective, that there was a constitutional Brown violation in Detroit. The part that the court overturned was the remedy. Okay, let me repeat that. The part that was overturned was the remedy. The part that would have knitted southeastern Michigan together, that was the part that was overturned. And in doing so, basically the court moves the goalpost and said the remedy is just too big. And if you want to bring the suburban school districts in, you have to prove plaintiffs that each and every one of those local school districts actually engaged in segregation themselves or created race discrimination in the city of Detroit. So it makes it, it's just, jump higher.
It's so frustrating when you get to that point. And am I right that Robert Bork provides much of the ammunition as Solicitor General?
Yeah, although interestingly, Robert Bork is Solicitor General. He's on the side of the Nixon administration. He supplies a brief that becomes part of the ruling, although the brief doesn't go as far as the Supremes did, because the brief suggested that, in fact, what you might want to do is remand, which is a fancy way of send the case back to the lower courts to see if there's enough evidence to support, metropolitan and segregation. The Supremes don't really say, well, we're going to have a remand. It's just like, you're done, you're out. We're going to find that the remedy exceeds the scope of the violation. So, but yeah, Bork's important too. Yeah, he's in there.
One thing that just killed me, Justice Lewis Powell, had been president of the segregationist Richmond School Board. Have I got that right? Not quite right? And so he had recused himself on a Richmond case, a Richmond desegregation case, but he didn't recuse himself on Detroit.
Yeah, so Powell and Rehnquist come up as a pair. You guys may remember, and I talk about this in the book, they're sort of nominated together. The President Nixon nominates them together, which I think was really a sophisticated and smart move, because you've got sort of, Rehnquist is like 41 or something, and he's the seemingly more ideologically doctrinaire of the two, and so it's sort of like if you bring them up as a pair, you're sure to get Powell through. And it turns out, of course, they get both of them through, even though there's some information that comes out about Chief Justice, or then Justice Rehnquist, that was very damaging, that I go into in detail in the book as well. But Powell, let's put it this way: he was more conservative than he appeared, and he had a deep knowledge of school and school matters, because he had sat on the Richmond School Board and then became the president, and he did recuse himself in a sort of similar case in the 1973 term, the Richmond case, but no recusal in Michigan.
Yeah. Well, before we go to questions, let me ask you this one. First, let me ask everybody to think about this. During the recent election, which you may recall, anybody hear the issue of segregation in the schools, the nation's schools, come up? That an issue that got a lot of attention in the debates? Did people ask the candidates about this? So there was one mention in the 2020 campaign. Remember, in a debate, Kamala Harris and Joe Biden go face-to-face over the issue of busing, school busing, which is how desegregation was framed, as Professor Adams explicates very clearly. And yet, I remember thinking at the time, I don't think anybody under 50 even knows what this issue is was about. And so my question is, how has this issue disappeared from mainstream public discourse in this country?
That's a good question. I'm trying to change it.
Yeah, this book is going to change that.
From your lips. I think framing is really important. I think political framing is really important. There's a guy named Matthew Delmont, a historian, who wrote a book about sort of transition in the North, and specifically about busing. And there's a character in my book, Irene McCabe, out of Pontiac. And one of the crucial things that happens, because there's a case in Pontiac that some of you guys may be aware of, a deseg case that's going on sort of at the same time as the Detroit case as well, is, I don't know if you guys did anybody ever used to watch Mad Men in here? Yeah, so there's I love that show, and it's about advertising, obviously, and the Don Draper character at one point says, you don't like what they're saying? Change the conversation. And I think that's really what you see happening in the 1970s, early 1970s, is the conversation was state-imposed segregation, white people being bad, and using the government to do that, right? The conversation was constitutional violations, black school children being discriminated against, separate and unequal schooling. That's the conversation. Suddenly, the conversation becomes busing. It's a different frame, right? And it shifts the attention from the underlying constitutional wrong to the idea that something's being taken away from someone else because they're being forced.
Taken away from white people.
Yeah, and being forced to be involved in some kind of remedy, and when they didn't actually do it. And I think that that's a really brilliant frame, and so part of the reason that this falls off, there are many others too, is just the way we think about this moment, and particularly the way we think about the North. We don't understand segregation very well, but the frame, the way that we talk about it, sort of just takes our attention off of what happened and makes us go another direction. There's actually a little discussion of colorblindness in the book too, because it's really, Irene McCabe, who was really telegenic and was an anti-busing activist, starts using the phrase colorblindness, which is like a really early use of that. And it's almost like testing different ways to sort of talk about things. And I think the busing frame was incredibly, incredibly useful to divert attention away from what was really happening.
One more thing. We're back to separate but unequal, right? We're back to Plessy versus Ferguson.
I mean, I hesitate to say that because,
De facto.
you know, I mean, is he okay? Okay. You know, things are different now than they were, and I want to be very clear about that. Things are better now than they were. You know, we don't know what's going to happen. This is our moment of discontent, but things are better than they were. When you say we're back to separate but equal, or separate and unequal, the argument for that is the following. There was another case called San Antonio, and that was decided before Milliken, and basically the San Antonio case says, well, you know, state could decide to fund fund public schools in a way that would mean that consistently low-income folks who couldn't tax themselves at a higher tax base because it's all based upon what the value of your home is, that having really different amounts of funding going to schools doesn't violate the Constitution. There's no fundamental right to education. So when you layer that on top of Milliken, which says that, you know, school district lines are impermeable, you can get a situation where you can have less well-resourced and less well-funded schools that are predominantly of color or predominantly black, and there's no constitutional violation, right? And so that can certainly lead to separate and unequal, right? And in many instances, we do have that. What the court would strike down today is if there were state laws that required that, right? What we have is the effect of that, right? But if the state law required that, then I'd like to believe even the Roberts Court would strike that down. But yeah, you know, none other than Justice Douglas made that observation. He said when you put San Antonio and Milliken together, you get separate and unequal. So it wasn't me, it was him.
I know there's some questions. What would people like to ask Professor Adams? Yes?
What is kind of what would you say to someone who kind of believes in like the critical race theory that they're going,
Thanks. What's your
Sorry.
name?
Ellie,
Hey, Ellie, how you doing?
good, how about you?
Good.
I just wanted to see what you would say to someone like far right who would, you know, talk about critical race theory and how it's an issue in schools, and that they say that the left are, you know, kind of blaming like all these white people that it's their fault, that like the history, like what would you say? Because I have a lot of issues with that in my workplace. I'm an EMT at MedStar, and it's a very blue-collar job. I just have issues. I'm usually the only Democratic person in my workplace.
So we talked about framing. We talked about Don Draper, right? So think about Don Draper. You don't like what they're saying, change the conversation. And I think that to a certain extent that's part of this. And I don't mean to minimize it at all, but you know, while we're all talking about critical race theory, which is an elective in law school, okay? Critical race theory is an elective, okay? So this is something that's been created to be the biggest and most important issue that's harming white folks, right? I think all we can do, and my contribution to what we can do, is to stand back and say, no, this isn't what really happened, right? And so that's why I think books and works of history and getting educated are so incredibly important. My contribution is to try to provide in a book that is broadly accessible, but that doesn't dumb anything down, I'm your translator, right? I want to translate, is to be able to say, this is what happened. So you can talk about critical race theory, which is a law school elective, all you want, but here's some facts. And I know that there's a contest about like your facts versus my facts. I understand that. And all we can do is continue to insist upon the factual record and then try to and then shift the burden to people to then say, what facts are you basing that on? What history are you basing that on? Show me your evidence. Where are your sources, right? And it's incredibly tiring. It is incredibly frustrating. But this is a democracy as long as we can keep it. And I think that's the kind of conversation that we have to have. I feel sorry that we have to continue to have it. But this is my offering, right? And I hope that it will help.
Hi.
What's your name?
Maggie.
Hi, Maggie.
Nice to meet you. So I had a question about like the pattern of behavior in the Roberts Court of them sort of, like for example, in like Shelby County v. Holder.
Oh, would you like to talk about Shelby County?
What?
You want to talk about Shelby County?
Yeah. How they'll a lot of times weaken equality acts on the basis of the fact that there's no, in their eyes, tangible proof of discrimination going on. How do you see this applying to like school segregation?
Yeah, I know. So this is a continuing conversation, right? So let's just give everybody a little background, a thumbnail sketch on Shelby County. Shelby County was decided in 2013, and it overturns a key portion of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, right? So there's a variety of provisions of the Voting Rights Act. One of them is called preclearance, and what was really smart about the Voting Rights Act is that it basically said, with respect to the worst offenders, which were mostly in the South, if you guys want to make a change, so like if you decide you want to move a polling place, or if you want to change your voting hours, you're going to have to go to a federal authority to get approval to make that change, because we know in the past when you did stuff like that, it was usually trying to prevent people from being able to vote. And what Shelby County does is it doesn't really strike down that portion of the Voting Rights Act, but there's another one called the quote-unquote coverage provision, and it's about sort of who's covered under the Voting Rights Act. And the court says, well, you know, there's not enough new information. You guys are relying on all this old data from like the 60s and 70s when white folks are really bad, but now they're good. And so Congress can't rely on that same old data if it wants to reenact and reauthorize the Voting Rights Act. So this goes back to the last conversation. It is true that in Shelby County, the court engages in make-believe, right? And it's particularly true because we know that the day of Shelby County and the day after it came down, you had states that kind of just said, oh, great, let's go back and, let's basically do a bunch of stuff that we couldn't have done that will frustrate the ability of voters of color to be able to cast ballots. So yeah, it's a problem. And I can't give you an easy answer, except to say 3 things about democracy, because my book has 3 democratic pieces in it. Number 1, little d democracy, big D democracy, and democratic socialization. Little d democracy was black parents and activists getting out into the streets in the 1960s to demonstrate in favor of integrating public schools. Big D democracy is about the importance of winning, is electoral, democracy. It's about the importance of winning elections. And I know we all know that, but we have to continue to remind ourselves that you got to win the election, right? Because if you don't win the election, then you can't have nice things. You can't have nice things. And then democratic socialization is how it is that we can create people who aren't giving you the kind of problem that you're having in your workplace. And I think, and there's good empirical evidence to show that having students educated together under conditions of equality creates the possibility for democratic socialization. And I think that's what the Brown Court understood, and it's what Justice Marshall understood in the dissent in Milliken versus Bradley. He said, if you can't learn together, you aren't gonna be able to live together. So I think we're at a bad moment right now. I think there's no two ways about it, and there's a lot of distraction. There's media breakup. And I guess I would say the same thing, which is that repeat, 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 repeat what is true, and then say it again.
We probably have time for one last question. I'm coming to you right now, sir. So we have time for buying books and signing books.
Hi, I'm Bill. I'm a retired union attorney. And I'm just looking for some insight because I feel like we are at a horrible impasse in that I would tell people all the time, we live in the era of Bush v. Gore. The Supreme Court of the United States selected George W. Bush by stopping a vote count in Florida. And as a result, we got not only 9/11, but we got the Iraq War. We have just had a group of so-called conservatives that, you know, you ever do labor arbitration, you get a panel and you can have alternate strike, right? Until you get somebody that you think is gonna be actually neutral and the like. Those mediocrities at the Supreme Court that have been doing this so-called conservative work couldn't survive a strike list because they have demonstrated that they are politicians in robes. They have basically turned around now and went against the provisions of the Constitution of the United States and essentially have put themselves in a position to waive the disability on a man who engaged in insurrection against the United States, despite the fact that Section 3, or Paragraph 3 of the 14th Amendment is explicit that disability that can only be removed by Congress. I'm getting up there in years, but the fight isn't out of me. My problem now is that how do we move forward, right? And I know we keep engaging in politics, but where we have politicians in robes that want to simply come along and destroy small d democracy in America.
Bill, I'm just a humble law professor. I'd love to be able to have the answer to that question.
But you do feel encouraged about some things that are going on, right?
Yeah, I do, and some of that's in the last chapter of the book. You know, some of the organizing that's going on the ground to try to move us in a direction of having more integrated and equally funded schools. I mean, I share many of your views. I don't have the answer to that. All I can say is that I'm passionately committed to democracy, passionately. And I'd like to believe that we will get through this moment. As I said before, this is what I offer. This is what I have to offer. But it's not an easy time. It's not an easy time.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Signing books for sale right out there.
I'm ready to sign books. Thank you so much. Great. My heart is full.